from her sharp eyes, Marianne Shad Carey blazed trails for women everywhere, and throughout her life, always
it, or just touching the surface of it, or actually doing nothing and playing on the people's emotions by politicizing this issue, but then dangling the so-called development in terms of infrastructure, which is what we're seeing across the continent. You tell people, we brought you a road, we brought you some kind of a railway line from one point to point B, but nobody addresses the bigger issue that with the massive corruption, the citizens of that country can never see the benefits of the trickle effect of having infrastructure development in their region.
Could this really make a difference, especially if people voted against what you just described as this massive corruption?
This could make a difference. This could make a difference. But the question is, do the people who vote most, and most of those are actually the poor people and the people in the rural areas, do they truly appreciate that the ruling party is responsible for all this? Because it's so easy for the ruling party, the way it has been framing it, that some of the issues they are suffering from, some of the poverty that they're dealing with has nothing to do with the corruption of the government. But some of it is, there is a reality of terrible weather, that they experience prolonged droughts, and they'll say that some of the issues that people are kind of dealing with today are being resolved slowly but surely. So it could make a difference, but I almost have a strong feeling that the ruling party, that the incumbent, Peter Mutharika, is likely to win a second term at age 78.
What do you make of the fact that there are a lot of critics who say that perhaps this is the time for Lazarus Chakwera, for example, the leader of Malawi Congress Party, the oldest party in Malawi, to garner votes because he has support from a lot of people, and not only that, he has an endorsement from the former President Joyce Banda.
Yes, I mean, he does have a shot at this, but the problem is the incumbency, benefits from incumbency. There's always an advantage of being in office. There have been, of course, talks about, there have been a lot of conversation around how the ruling party has suppressed the freedom, suppressed the voters, especially in the opposition areas. And so while there could be a number of people willing to vote for the opposition, the advantage of the incumbent is that they are able to manipulate, to suppress. There's a so-called voter suppression, to frustrate the opposition and just make sure that they do not win fairly. I mean, the opposition doesn't mean that it's going to, if it loses, it will be a fair game here. There's a likelihood that the ruling party will win, but how fair will that be will be subject to discussion by tomorrow or the day after.
Are you suggesting that the Malawi Electoral Commission is going to perhaps use what I would characterize as a style kind of counting the ballots, where it doesn't matter who shows up to vote, but who counts the vote?
It has always been true across the continent that it is who counts the vote. And unfortunately, it is the case in Malawi, as it is in many other countries, that the Electoral Commission is very closely linked with the ruling party. There hasn't been a clear delinking of the Electoral Commission in most of African countries from the ruling party. So the incumbent has that advantage of literally having a close association with the people who are going to vote, to count the vote, and those are the ones who actually determine who wins the election. It's not the ones, it's not the voters. It is those ones who are counting, and those who are counting are part of the system. Unfortunate.
Yeah, interesting. Let's go to a comment. Let's go to Terry Sinclair. How do we prevent anomalies from happening during elections?
Yes.
Great point.
In fact, one of the things that has to be done across the continent is years before an election, even say soon after these Malawi elections, the institutions, the different organizations should fight to create a very independent electoral commission that is completely delinked from the government. The opposition parties should not be focusing on winning the next election, on trying to convince people to vote for them, because, as we say, the most important thing is who conducts the election, who oversees the election, and who counts the votes. So you want a thoroughly independent electoral body that will not have any interference from any political party, whether the opposition or the ruling party. Now, once you put that in place, whether it is in Malawi, in Kenya, in Uganda, you can now count on a fair and free election. But as long as Africa continues to allow electoral commissions that are literally an extension of the ruling party, you can never be sure of what the outcome of an election will be. We've seen that even in Kenya, where it looked almost like you could predict the results until the Electoral Commission decided otherwise.
Interesting. Yeah. Let's continue. Let's go to another comment. Let's go to Ninsima Jonathan. Why do you continue to cover politics when it continuously is the same pattern over and over again?
Yes. Well, it's a painful experience sometimes, even for journalists to keep covering things that seem to be a kind of a repetition, a kind of a regurgitation of what we've done over the years. But then that is the reality of the moment. I mean, people expect, for example, for us to tell them about what's going on in Malawi. We cannot give them a blackout. There's a demand, there's a need to keep up with the news, and the news sometimes seems to be cyclic. What's happening in Malawi will happen tomorrow in Zimbabwe and in another country. Same issues. Problem is people demand that we cover these issues. We could do, our job is to tell the story. It's actually to tell the story of what's going on, so we are not the ones who change what happens on the ground. There are others who have the responsibility to change what's going on the ground, what's going on the ground. For us as journalists, our job is to tell the story, and we have to keep telling the story.
Speaking of change, there are a lot of young people in Malawi who think that maybe it's about time that country underwent some kind of a reform or change, not just at the top level, but a fundamental change of all the institutions, of everything that is happening, that is going wrong in Malawi. You're looking at young people saying that maybe this election, they wanted to vote for a younger person who sort of represents their views, who is going to usher in some kind of employment for these young people.
You see, I think it is good to have a fresh face, a younger person, but that's not a guarantee. A guarantee is having institutions that are working for the citizens of a country and having leaders that who have a real intention and determination to transform their countries. They could be older, they could be way younger, but there's evidence across the continent that there have been some very young people who are terrible presidents.
Well, people argue that Saulas Chalema, Vice President Saulas Chalema, could be exactly what you're just describing.
Well, he
has the aptitude, he has the charisma, he's a young guy, and he's a very, very successful business person.
Yeah, but that's optimism. There's something about politics that transforms people. We've seen so many people who looked like they meant well, who looked like they have what it took, including the age, the aptitude, and whatever they were doing at that moment. But once they get into power, that's when you can prove who they really are. Because power does corrupt. It has the propensity to corrupt even the most well-intentioned person. That is why I think the focus has to be having institutions that hold leaders accountable. If you hold leaders accountable, regardless of whether they're 20 years old or 40 years old or 78 years old, if you have institutions that will ensure that they perform and that they deliver, and that if they do not deliver, there will be consequences. Unless you have those institutions, it doesn't really matter how young they are. In Congo, we had a person who came to power at the age 29. But ask the Congolese how excited they have been for so many years. Across the continent, if you go back in history, the first presidents after independence in most countries were in their 20s. Well, what happened to them? They stayed in power for too long. And what happened? They transformed into whatever they became to be, dictators and monsters, some of them. Someone in East Africa today is up in the 70s, I know. But when he came to power, he was a young person, fighting in the bushes in northern Uganda. People looked with hope, whether it was in Kenya, in Sudan, in Ethiopia, and elsewhere. The age is something good to have young people to represent the youth. But I'm telling you, the youth can be extremely disappointed in one of their own if there's no system that holds that person accountable. It doesn't really matter. Human beings have the propensity to be corrupted by power. Political power is really dangerous.
How do you respond to this comment here from Peter Ayolo Tyler? Africa needs determined and focused leaders, not dictators.
Oh, yes. No country needs a dictator. You need determined, focused, really well-intentioned leaders. But those leaders need to be held accountable. So you need, Africa actually more than anything else, needs institutions, because it's the institutions that fail people. You cannot put your trust on a person. It doesn't matter how good he appears to be, because remember, you really don't know how good or bad a leader will be until they get in the position of power. You don't know what power will do to them. or we don't know how they will be not only transformed by the challenges of the office, but how the people around them may want to mold them into something that perhaps wasn't their intention. That's why you need the institutions. It's only the institutions that can save people. A really independent judiciary, a parliament system that acts independent of the executive, and of course a citizen that is informed, that can challenge the leadership. Across the continent, what do we have? People generally worship leaders from the lowest ranks to the top. When the leader shows around, they dance and sing for him, even if he's been stealing blind from the entire village or from the entire constituency. You need an informed citizenry. You need institutions that will ensure leaders can be held accountable and compelled to do their job right.
Compelled to do their job right, that's a perfect segue. Let's maybe cross over to a different topic. Let's talk about the act or the spirit of giving. Over the weekend, we saw here in the United States, one billionaire, tech billionaire, almost surprised everybody when he announced that he was going to pay over $40 million to help students who are just graduating to pay off all their debt. And today we saw something similar in Ethiopia, where the prime minister had a dinner, and each guest, invited guest, was paying $173,000. That's a whole lot of money for one plate of food.
Exactly. But you see, the people went in knowing exactly what they want to do. What that tells you is that, first, there's a lot of wealth in the hands of many people across the world. So one just needs to sit back and ask, how can I give back to society? Well, if you have $100 million, if you have $1 billion, they did not just fall from the skies. It means you made this money from the people, from the citizens, whether they were buying your goods or they were, buying into your services. So one of the things that was given as a very good example by this billionaire for Morehouse is that, you can give back in society in a more meaningful way, in a real way, by giving to kids who have just graduated and who owe so much money. You have not only helped that individual, but you have helped their family.
Right.
And for that millionaire, that billionaire, that may not be so much money. Now, what you're seeing in Ethiopia was very impressive in that this guest, about, how many of them? 300 of them were invited. And they were told specifically they're going to buy these expensive meals to fundraise for development in Ethiopia. In fact, I've been told that Abiy Ahmed has challenged Ethiopians in the diaspora here in the U.S. to forego, like, their coffee just one day and give $1 every day for a certain amount of time to raise funds for infrastructure development in Ethiopia. What could that mean? You're not only giving back to society, but you're helping your countries to be free of foreign debts. So instead of having to look to China or to Europe for, loans, there are so many citizens who have so much money that they could actually contribute to the development of their countries, which will empower the countries to pursue certain policies without being beholden to a foreign benefactor. We have seen a few conversations also in northern Nigeria where some CEOs of companies there, after visiting some parts of northern Nigeria, said they're going to do like a fundraiser. I think it is a challenge to many of the wealthy people across the continent to see how they can give back to either their local communities or even to national projects, such that instead of having to rely on foreigners, on China, on the Europeans and Americans, there could be a little part of a fraction of the developmental money that could actually be homegrown, that could also be, resourced or sourced from within, and that will save the country a lot.
Let's maybe get into the politics of this. Is it sustainable? Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed inviting 300 guests and asking them to pay $173,000. Is it sustainable? Or it's just one of those PR stunts?
It could be a PR stunt, but it's real. For the moment, that money actually is real. If you get that money and you do a specific project, it could inspire people to do something similar. You see, it could actually decentralize from Addis Ababa, and perhaps people of a particular region of Ethiopia could decide to bring together people from that region who have money and fundraise and build a school, build a hospital somewhere. I think it is sustainable depending on how, you know, progressively they use the money that was fundraised. If this money can be used in a way that people can see and can be associated with a project that people can see and people can benefit from, it is possible another year from now to call people back and say, can we also do another fundraiser? But if it's maybe done and you raise all this money and nobody knows where the money went to, it could be a short-term political stand, you know. But I think this can be sustainable. Why not? People have the money and they can keep giving if they're willing. But if they see where their money is going, they can keep giving.
Well, there is a comment coming in, and this person, Emil, wants, can African leaders... okay, no, it just disappeared. Okay, let me follow up with a different question. Going back to Ethiopia, the thing is, you have a lot of people. Unemployment in Ethiopia is almost at 20%. You have a lot of homeless people. I was actually surprised to see that people, the business community, and some very wealthy guys can come up with that money cash, and yet you have all sorts of things going on in that country.
Yeah, so that tells you, and this is a big challenge for the new Prime Minister, Abiy Ahmed, that in fact, the challenges are enormous, but you have to start tackling them from a place. Now, for a country like Ethiopia, just like it is in so many other countries also, it's having to come to terms with the reality of your nation, the level of poverty, and then establish what really is the cause of this poverty and how can we start fighting and eliminating that poverty in that country. So one of the things that has emerged from Ethiopia is that, for example, it has become a source of very cheap labor. So how do you add value to the labor that your people provide to multinational companies? Today, Ethiopians are some of the most, the biggest number of employees on Western and Chinese garment-making companies. They're making all these clothes, all these garments, but they are some of the lowest paid. Actually, they say they are the lowest paid in the world. So I think it behoves on the government of Ethiopia to make sure they add value to the labor that is being given by the citizens of Ethiopia so that the Ethiopians can have more money to use for their own development. But also,
in other words, these rich guys are taking advantage of the ordinary guys.
Yeah. So you find even some of it doesn't matter whether you're an Ethiopian or a Western or a Chinese that is setting up business in Ethiopia. I think the government needs to come up strong and say, we need to dignify our people of Ethiopia by making sure they get paid a decent wages that will get them out of poverty. And also it goes into the area of agriculture. There have been a lot of land that has been given to foreign countries, to foreign companies, Middle East companies in Ethiopia itself, where you move people from land and have foreigners coming there to do agriculture that is going to benefit those countries. How do you ensure that your own citizens are going to be beneficiaries of this foreign investment? There's a lot of bad investment, external investment, where people coming in, investing, and taking away everything without adding value to the labor of the people that the people are providing, but also of the resources that they're taking away. You have to give back to that country.
Let's go to Emily or Kilo. Africans can't have good leaders when they're not good followers. How do we reduce themselves? Some of them have reduced themselves to ethnic bigots and praise singers.
Yes.
What is that supposed to be?
Yeah, what that is that actually that is what the strategy that politicians have used very effectively. Everybody knows that Africa was based on tribes as kingdoms and chieftains, and it was organized as such before the colonialists came. Now, when colonialism came, it lumped certain people together and made them countries, Uganda, Tanzania, Ethiopia, and other places. Now, the big challenge has been, how does a country, say Kenya, Uganda, Ethiopia, become a nation out of so many nations? politicians have known how to utilize the ethnic differences for political use. They weaponize ethnicity, and they make themselves tribal leaders rather than national leaders. And so they frame the politics in such a way that people think their interest is the interest of that person from their tribe. So the good thing is that I think the younger generation is realizing that you need to be operating as a nation rather than as a tribe, because then the interests of a tribe may be narrower and become in conflict with that of the nation. So the only way this can change is to have leaders who can see the country holistically rather than play the politics of dividing people along ethnic lines. Until you do that, of course, we will continue the bad politics that we have.
Speaking about dividing people along ethnic lines, let's go to South Sudan. Let's go to Amos Bale. What is the fate of peace in South Sudan with the two entities disagreeing against each other?
Again and again and again.
Yes.
In fact, it has been very frustrating for those of us who covered the formation of South Sudan. It has been the same cyclic kind of frustration of the two leaders disagreeing, Riek Machar and Salva Kiir. Now, what is the fate of the peace there? It is unknown, because the two leaders have come many times very close to agreeing. They have actually been together in a government, one as president, one as the deputy president, and they've disagreed. Now, the reason why they've been unable to resolve the issue is that they are men with big egos, and they have put their tribes behind them. They have refused to see South Sudan as one country with one destiny, with one common interest. Everybody's fighting to have what they see as the interest of their ethnic group. So the only way that this can change is if these guys at some point can come together, put aside their tribal differences, in fact, put aside the tribe and see themselves as South Sudanese, and resolve the issues that affect the nation of South Sudan rather than the issues that are very of interest only to their, their narrow ethnic groups. Other than that, you'll continue having the disagreements, and the peace process might drag on for another 10 years.
Yeah, well, what are you talking about tomorrow on Straight Talk Africa?
Straight Talk Africa tomorrow, we talk about the role of the diaspora, the African diaspora in the United States. We're going to look at how do those who are here that left the continent from different countries, how they're organized here, and how what kind of role they play back in their countries on the continent, whether there is an influence that they have on socio, political, and economic issues on the continent, and to what extent is that benefiting the citizens of the continent of Africa.
Do you think that the diaspora here is playing a critical role back home?
Well, that is debatable, but in some countries, actually, it is playing a role. There are those who are involved. Let's take it, for example, the diaspora in the United States contributes to the economies of those countries by remittances. The amount of money that is sent to African countries from those who live in the diaspora is mind-boggling. Sometimes it's more than the money that those African countries get from donors from the World Bank and the Europeans and Americans combined. So in that sense itself, you can tell that you can say they contribute in the economic development of their countries in a very real way. But also there are also other social issues. Others have played activism roles. They have pushed change of policies here in Washington towards some of their countries. People from South Sudan have helped, for example, to keep focus on the peace process so that the U.S. and other Western entities can put pressure on those politicians to attain kind of a peaceful resolution to the conflict. So they played the role. They play a role in different ways, though.
Well, on that note, thank you so much, Vincent, for filling in for Shakasali, who is on assignment. I will be back maybe in about 2 weeks. But in the meantime, we look forward to hosting you on another edition of Shaka Extra Time. Until then, so long from Washington. Thank you so much.
Thank you.